Good evening, everyone. I'm Anil Dharkar, welcoming you to Literature Live, Brightness of Books. This is a series in which we bring new books and their authors to you. I'm sure you will agree that literature and reading help in bringing light into the prevailing darkness. Today, it's my great pleasure to introduce one of India's brightest young public intellectuals, Pankaj Mishra, whose new book, Bland Fanatics, Liberals, Race and Empire, has just come out. In conversation with him is Literature Live's favorite author, poet and journalist, Jerry Pinto. Welcome, Pankaj in London and Jerry in Mumbai. Over to you. Jerry, take over.
Thank you. Thanks, Anil. It's very nice to be described like that. I'm someone's favorite something at last. Pankaj, it's always a pleasure to be talking to you. I remember the first encounter that we had on the lawns of the NCPA, where we chatted about, strangely enough, about Bollywood and Hollywood, and we discussed the possibility of doing a book, me doing a book on that. I've been reading
that, yeah.
Yeah, I've been reading Bland Fanatics and always, as always, startled and amazed by the range of your erudition. So I just wanted to ask, having taken the pants of the liberals, if Pankaj Mishra were to ask to define himself, what would he say? Where would you place yourself?
Probably one of the problems that I try to identify in this book is the great desire to claim a moral high ground by categorizing oneself or giving oneself a kind of moral status by saying you're a liberal or indeed you're a socialist. I think perhaps we should work towards a more modest self-description. I really think of myself as a writer, merely as a writer who's trying to figure out, the world that he lives in, trying to understand more and more about things that I failed to understand in the past. And really, I suppose I'm writing this book today because liberalism and liberals have been dominant for the last 20, 25 years, the time during which I started to write and think about these issues. If I was born in another country, if I was born in another age, I would be writing about the ideologies dominant in that particular place at that particular time. And I would still, think of myself as a writer. So in a way, I think a lot of our problems begin when we sort of, think that we've actually really figured this out and we have the right set of ideas or right ideology with which to, sort out the rest of the world.
Coming at this argument from another perspective, if young readers to say, yes, you critique the liberal ideology, but what is the standpoint from which you critique it? What would you be then say?
The standpoint of someone who's actually seen the consequences of uncritical thinking in a range of endeavors. Someone who's actually observed how people can dress up their thought, actually advance their self-interest in the guise of thought, and they need not be liberals. As I say, it's the reason why the book is directed against liberals and liberalism, because that was the dominant and the hegemonic ideology. It could be any ideology. If I'd been born in the 1960s or 70s or living under a communist regime, I would probably be ranged against the propaganda and the lies that the communist regime was putting out at the time. But that's not the time I grew up in. That's not the place that I grew up in. So it's really the standpoint of an observer, a witness, and someone who experiences realities, someone who is simply not, sitting in some very secluded, isolated place and sort of thinking up ideas, abstractions, or dealing with abstractions, but actually traveling to places, talking to people, learning about how they think of themselves and their place in the wider world, and then arriving at some conclusions on the basis of that. So not just book learning, not just dealing with abstractions disconnected from history, from lived experiences, but actually sort of taking those experiences, life worlds into account. So that is really the standpoint. Of course, some people might say, and people do say, that that is in itself a kind of mystification, ideological mystification, the pose of the neutral observer, the commentator who is above all ideologies, in which case, I can make plain my own commitments, which are obviously at a very fundamental level to a just society, a society where the equality of human beings is honored and acknowledged. I mean, that's what is the kind of basic hope and ideal that I work with in everything I write. So that is, to answer your question, that is kind of my standpoint. Yeah.
So I'm glad you talked about journeys and travel, because the thing that occurred to me was, would you like to just give us a very short sentimental journey? What were the major inflection points that brought you to this place where, from the author of Butter Chicken in Ludhiana and the fiction writer of the Romantics to the heir of Edward Said as your buddies at The Economist have labeled you. Can you just tell us, the inflection points? Are there any moments, any epiphanies?
I think I haven't actually, to be honest, systematically reflected on that. And perhaps a writer shouldn't really, think too much about how they got to where they are today, because you become paralyzed by, this kind of self-consciousness. And, there's also, it doesn't do much for your ego, which should always be somewhat wounded and somewhat small. But, I really think, since you brought up Butter Chicken, that was in many ways a kind of formative journey for me. When I started writing it, I was living up in Mashobra in Himachal, and I had spent 3 or 4 years at that time in this very isolated place, having a wonderful life, reading, writing, thinking about making notes for all kinds of books I would write in the future. And then I was suddenly found myself plunged in this very dynamic, very chaotic world of small town India, and traveling through India for several months, and then coming back and writing about it, thinking about the experience, giving it some kind of order. That really was my first encounter with just how most people live their lives, or the thoughts they were thinking, what kind of India they were imagining, what kind of place they were thinking for themselves in that new India coming into being. And when I haven't actually gone back to that book, but occasionally someone tells me something that they read in it, and I go back and look at it, and I'm surprised by how much of India over the last 20, 25 years is contained in some of these experiences and encounters that I describe in the book, whether it's anti-Muslim bigotry, whether it's the new forms of Bollywood films that had started to arrive in the early 90s. Obviously much more about the subject than I do, but I'm talking about films like Dar or the early Shah Rukh Khans. So it's all there in the book, and I think that book really kind of set me thinking about what is the shape of modernization in India. What shape is this assuming? Because Nehru, the early leaders of India, when they promised modernization, they all assumed that it will have a very benign outcome, that we all be educated, much, much better than our ancestors were, that we would go and work in offices, we wouldn't have to, work in the fields anymore. We'll move from an agricultural economy to an industrialized economy. We will move from living in small towns and villages to large cities. And Butter Chicken, or the journeys for Butter Chicken, made me question each one of those assumptions. As far as I could see, that modernization program in India had started to go terribly wrong. I mean, much before the 90s, of course, that it was producing, all kinds of problems, a lot of mass disaffection, a lot of, of course, ugliness, aesthetic ugliness, which you can even today see in many parts of India, and also a kind of toxic politics that was rising to the fore because so many people were so unhappy and frustrated, angry with the way the political system, the social system had marginalized them. So this is a very long answer and probably a very boring answer to your question. But I mean, I think that was the crucial journey for me. And then the second one happened soon afterwards, which was the journey to Kashmir. And I actually write about that in the new book, which is that, going to Kashmir with all the inherited prejudices of someone from North India, someone from an upper caste North Indian family, thinking, oh, the Kashmiris are much better off with us Indians. We are secular, democratic, whereas the Pakistanis are just going to eat them alive if we let them. So it's our duty to keep the Kashmiris happy and on our side. And whatever the Kashmiris might think about Pakistan or about independence, actually, the real happiness lies in being with India. So when I went there, I just realized that, I was, and most of us in India had consented to, without their realizing it or knowing it, to a military occupation. It was as simple as that. And that Kashmir was effectively under military occupation and under a very brutal military occupation. And that sort of realization that India, several decades after it won its independence from an imperialist power, had itself become an imperialist power was too shocking, was very shocking for me. And so that also made me question a whole set of assumptions about, myself, about Indian democracy, about Indian liberalism, what that really amount to if we were not going to grant the right of self-determination, if we were not going to grant equal rights to Kashmiri Muslims. So those two journeys, I think, one in the mid-90s and the early in the late 90s, the later one, really were crucial in my formation when I look back. I mean, I'm sure there are others as well, but those are the two ones that come to mind.
So, in the new book that we are looking at right now, there are a lot of the essays it seem to be book review essays, where you connect the dots and you bring in you look at a book in its context and you set it up for us. But both reading and writing seem to take a tremendous amount of time. How do you manage both? Because your range of references is kind of like, you bring in fiction, you bring in biographies, history, economics, politics. It's awe-inspiring, actually.
That's very kind of you, Jerry, but I think it'll seem all seem much simpler when I say that, but that's all I do. I wake up in the morning and I get to work. I write, I read, I make notes. And if you do that, 6 to 7 to 8 hours a day, you'll actually end up reading a lot of stuff out there. And so it doesn't seem that surprising to me.
Oh, no. I just was wondering, like, for instance, when you said making notes, when you are reading, you stop actually and make a note. Like, for instance, you'll often have the opposite line from a novel that will illuminate something that you're talking about in a non-fiction book. And I wonder, how does he remember that? So do you make notes while you're reading novels as well?
I do. And to tell you, actually, the arrival of digital technologies has considerably simplified my task. So I shouldn't be, promoting brands in this conversation, but Evernote, for instance, which allows you to make notes and then you can sync them across various devices. Ever since Evernote arrived, which was some years ago, I found that, I can just make a little note, search for it whenever I want to. So it's not my brilliant memory that is to be credited for these quotations, but it's actually Evernote. I'll put something in it and then I can search for it if I can't locate it or can't remember exactly where it is. Likewise, the arrival of ebooks, the ability to search for particular words in a book, which in the past would have taken you a lot of time. I mean, I know I used to do that all the time and then get very frustrated because You wouldn't just find the word, even though you knew it was there. But now with, with ebooks, you can find those books. So a lot of those, tasks of memory, remembrance have now been outsourced to these, digital note-taking apps, which, have come as a great boon to me. But, it's also true that, especially while I was up in Mashobra in Himachal, in fact, I haven't read that many books in the last decade or so, ever since I started spending more time in London. When I was up in Himachal, I would read a book a day, 200, 250 page book. I could easily finish it in a day, make some notes, kind of put some lines that I liked in a notebook, and then put it away. So if you do that over several years, several months, several weeks, you'll end up with a good size intellectual capital on which to draw upon later in life. So I was saved, I didn't really have a job. I didn't really work in an office. So that's, what I've really done most of my life.
I was fascinated by the Indian response to the Black Lives Matter campaign. And Ta-Nehisi Coates, whom you review in the book, seems to go unread in India. So why do you think that campaign had so much resonance here?
Well, I think we in India like to attach our little bandwagons to whatever is globally trending or whatever seems globally chic and important and sophisticated. Hence this, bizarre spectacle of people who've never spared a single second on caste or the problems of caste inequalities in India, suddenly coming out as great supporters of Black Lives Movement in the United States, not really knowing even the histories of of the United States or just where Black Lives Matter started, what it aims to do, but simply as a hashtag, it was irresistible to not just people in India, but had various other parts of the world where people immediately wanted to be seen as great defenders of social justice and as great sort of campaigners against all kinds of inequities. But in the end, if you're unable to connect the plight of people in the United States to people in your own country, if you're unable to see just how much suffering, exploitation, injustice exists within your own socioeconomic systems, then of course it looks too blatantly a kind of fashion statement, really, which is I think in most cases what it was. I mean, most egregiously in the case of some actress who advertises for Fair and Lovely and still felt compelled to stand with Black people.
Mm-hmm. This is the thing, I think, this fact that Ta-Nehisi Coates, I think, says something about how lots of white people like to read his books. There is a kind of bemusement, I think, to that. There are lots of white people who like to read Pankaj Mishra's books. And Pankaj Mishra goes from being, like the top of the caste hierarchy in India to being, a Black boy in white society. How did you make that shift? Or was there a shift that had to be made?
I don't know whether there are massive shifts to be made. I mean, I think, in the end, what you write will be received very differently by readers around the world, who will read into what you write their own experiences, their own assumptions, their own prejudices. And there is very little you can do about that process as a writer. All you can do is render your experience as faithfully and accurately as you can. And then you have to sort of leave it to, this huge amorphous mass of readers out there who can decide what they want to take from it. They can be white, they can be Black, they can be any race, any ethnic, national background. I mean, now with the arrival of the internet, you become aware of a vast international audience out there, which is very diverse, ethnically very mixed, different national backgrounds. And they're all bringing to it, yesterday I received an email from two Serbian academics wanting me to come and talk about Yugoslavia and how my work connects with what they have been writing about Yugoslavia. I have absolutely no idea in what way my work connects with what they have been writing all their lives about Yugoslavia. Maybe I'll find out. But it's just an example to say that how now that we have this international audience, thanks to the internet, all kinds of experiences can be compared, can be put together, can speak to each other in a way that was not possible when you and I were growing up in India, where we were very much confined to our particular spaces with particular readers, and with very little possibility of breaking out of that.
Mm-hmm. So, these essays, they're admirable and they're elegant and they're well argued, but they often leave you with the feeling that, all is lost. We should flee, except where you're supposed to flee. So my question is, are you hopeful?
Oh, I'm very hopeful. Actually, I wouldn't be writing at all if I wasn't hopeful. I'm hopeful because I feel that a whole lot of ideologies that I've been criticizing or attacking over a long period are finally being proved, not by ideas or abstractions, but by actual events, to have been defective and faulty all along. So whether it's the response to the pandemic, whether it's Brexit, whether it's the election of Trump, I think we can safely say that the world as it was described by many of the people I criticize in the book is not the world that we are living in today. So we need new thinking, we need renewed imaginations, moral, political, economic. And I feel like that work can only really happen when we first engage in the task of criticism, which is, my primary task. Now, people who are too wedded to the old world, people who are too wedded to the status quo might not like what I write. In fact, they don't like what I write because they feel that that is the world they found their identity in. And they don't want to let go of it. But whether they like it or not, that world is passing, that world is going, and things are changing very dramatically, very radically. And the world that waits for us will be something that will require a huge imaginative, intellectual efforts from all of us. But the ground has to be cleared first. And I see myself and the work of many other people, many other writers, as doing that exactly. Clearing the ground for new forms of thinking. And again, hope is absolutely crucial to that project. I mean, how can you go on without hope?
Truly. So if you had to, when you say cleaning the ground for new thinking, when you talk about, but with the educational systems in the mess, with young people increasingly disaffected, how is that new hope supposed to, what can we do to help that project is what I'm saying.
I think, as writers, we can only really appeal to people or speak to people who in the first place are interested in what we have to say or interested in what writers in general have to say. And, that has always been a very small audience. To move from that role to a larger role, that of the activist or the politician, is something that, I might or might not make. But right now, as a writer, as someone who writes for certain kinds of periodicals and addresses certain audiences, my role, I find that it is to actually talk to people who are somewhat interested in the possibility of change. Obviously, there are so many sources of, I'd say, despair in the wider world today. And, the things you just mentioned, political indifference, people being too distracted by their phones, or people, much worse than that, people being, in a way, misled by propaganda, by simple lies and falsehoods that are floating around on social media or on WhatsApp. I mean, in one sense, those problems have always been there. They're obviously magnified by digital media. But in the end, I think we all have to do our work and not really surrender to, the council of despair, which is, oh my word, the world is falling apart. There's nothing to be done. People like Trump and Boris Johnson are in charge, and there's simply no hope whatsoever. In the end, we all have to, whatever we are doing, is to work towards a better society and better set of circumstances than we have right now.
Mm-hmm. I think, I read somewhere that a historian was asked about his opinion of the Treaty of Versailles, and he said, "Isn't it rather too early to say?" So when you are, you're thinking and talking so often about uh, current events, which will become the history of tomorrow, and very often you take an admirably clear position on them. Do you feel that it's early to say, or do you just go
It's
out
too
there?
early to say about a lot of things. I mean, I think we haven't come to the end of this. This is where people who declared an end to history back in the late 80s and early 90s went completely wrong. I mean, they were the people who should have told themselves it is too early to say that the so-called West might have won the Cold War in one very narrow sense, that Soviet communism collapsed, or the Soviet Union collapsed. But it was too early to say that democracy and capitalism and technology were going to benignly triumph all around the world. Now we know that the verdict is really wide open right now, and that all those hopes have been greatly belied. I mean, you can look at it from the other side and say, China is rising today. China is a major power. It's recovering fast from the pandemic. It's already embarked on a trajectory of growth. But again, you can say it's too early to say, and that would be the right thing to say at that time, because anything can happen in the next 10 years, and even in the next 5 years, which makes all of us look like, or people who are predicting China's unstoppable rise, they can look like idiots in 5 years' time. So one should always, I feel like, proceed with caution. I mean, George Orwell has a great line about intellectuals always thinking that whatever is happening in the present, whatever trend is winning, whatever movement is winning, that will always also win in the future. And that is one thing that intellectuals in particular have to guard against, because they can just simply project too far into the future and not really take into account any number of completely unprecedented, unforeseen events, such as the pandemic. I mean, that's a very good instance of something that hardly anyone anticipated has completely overturned so many of our political expectations, not to mention, various economies, strong economies.
I was wondering about technology, because the new priesthood seems to be the technological priesthood. It used to be doctors earlier. That Shaw said that we had doctors now for priests, and now we have the technologist who is promising everything on an app. What's your take on the app world?
Well, I try and stay away from it as long as the ones that I'm obviously using greatly are the note-taking apps. But apart from those, I keep my distance from technology. In fact, I'm determined to, in some sense, push technology out of my life, because I really do feel that it is changing, radically reconfiguring the way we think about ourselves, the way we think about the world. In other words, reconfiguring our brains to the point where, I think something essentially human is being lost. And that this process of being predetermined, of having set responses, responding reflexively to certain things, all this is being in some ways aggravated by technology. So I personally am extremely wary of it, and I feel that with the pandemic, the role of technology in our lives is taking on an importance and a kind of power that it might not easily shed for a long time. I mean, simply something as simple as test and trace just means that somebody out there, or some institution, some data bank out there is monitoring various aspects of your life, your movements, and this, intrusion, and intrusion is what it is, might become permanent. I mean, I think we have to be especially worried about this in places like India, where there aren't any, sort of checks and balances on the power of the surveillance states. In fact, it's sort of it's pretty much open field to them. They can do whatever they want, and there's very little recourse against their intrusive tactics.
Mhm. But this is the thing I was thinking about, that right now we have the potential, because again of technology, to know what's happening in, say, in the Congo, or to know what's happening in the Amazon. And at the same time, you want to know, most of the time you want to know what's happening in your back door, like in your backyard, because that's what's important. I mean, during the pandemic time, the question of whether we would get spinach on the streets was kind of central to most people's thought process.
Yeah.
So how, when you're trying to be a kind of a concerned citizen and aware citizen, how are you supposed to, how are you supposed to process this world and its availability through technology?
Yeah.
How do you do it?
I think that's, Jerry, that's a really, hugely important point, because I think we've started to think far too complacently of citizenship as something global. Of course, it's global at a certain level, but it's a level of abstraction. As global citizens, we have to be concerned about our consumption habits because of what they are doing to the environment. We have to be aware of, other people's and their rights, their suffering. But in the end, the responsibilities of citizenship are mostly discharged at home, locally. This is again something the pandemic has brought home to many of us, that what is happening in your immediate neighborhood, in your city, in your region, is far, far more important than what is happening elsewhere. Something interesting has happened in the last few months is that international coverage has dropped off. I don't know if you've noticed in the newspaper.
Right.
You don't really know. I mean, when news comes to you from somewhere else, it's mostly news of the coronavirus pandemic and the response to it, or the number of infections going up and down in various countries around the world. I mean, there's a lot of this kind of information out there, but not much else about what's happening in other countries. It is because people are rightly obsessed with what is happening to people around them in their immediate neighborhoods. Staying cooped up in houses for weeks and months on end, your preoccupations naturally shrink, and that is what has happened. But I think it is also reminding us that this onslaught of information that we've suffered over the last 10, 15 years or 20 years since the internet arrived, what good has it really done to our ability to receive, to absorb information, and then to act upon it? We are as helpless as before, if not more so, because we are processing far too many atrocities out there. We are trying to understand what is happening into various peoples around the world, whether it's the Uyghur Muslims or whether it's the Amazonian people living in the Amazonian rainforest. But really, has our capacity to act, has that also been enhanced at the same time that we're receiving all this information? The answer is no. So all this information leaves us more helpless than before, and at the same time distracting us from the more important things, which is love, sympathy, affection for the people around you. Which are also, I think these things are connected with the responsibilities of citizenship, of thinking of society in those ways, and thinking of it as a real organism full of real human lives with which you interact, as opposed to something that you consume, something that comes to you through the broadband cable.
But this, do you suspect that we'll be able to roll this back? I mean, I know you're trying to roll it back yourself, you said, in some ways, but in other ways, do you think we're being hardwired into another tribe? E-tribe, a cyber tribe, something.
Well, I mean, it is very, very difficult, I think. I'm not as exposed to it as most people are, not on social media, and I stay away from the internet as much as possible unless I'm doing research or looking for something. But I can feel even in my own mind there is a tendency to be addicted to this stuff, to move from link to link and to follow certain narratives and stories, and it, unless you are really on guard against that tendency, it can really overwhelm you. And unfortunately, that is really the experience of large numbers of people today, where the smartphone has become the source of news, of identity, of fantasy, everything contained in that little slab. And that is a very disturbing new development in human history. I don't think we've encountered this before. I mean, I think the arrival of print technologies or even the television did not really inaugurate such a sort of extensive reconfiguring of the human brain. So you're right. I mean, I think you're right to be concerned about this process and to wonder whether it can be rolled back. But I think things like the experience or the near experience of death, illness, infirmity, also brings home to you the things that are important and vital to your own well-being. And I think in that one sense, that might be the lesson of the pandemic, for some people at least, that making sure that your environments are safe, that they are clean, that you live in a society that is equipped to confront, to respond to something like this collectively, that these are more important things than emphasizing about politics and events elsewhere.
So just as a question, if this information technology, I mean, right now it seems like young people seem to think that everything can be solved by an app, like including the health crisis or like food. It bothers me because at some point there has to be delivery, right? I mean, you have to actually have somebody going and giving an injection or feeding somebody. So there has to be some physical labor, and that's never accounted for in an app. But I'm thinking, as an observer, you have, how will you, if you do not experience this information technology and its manipulations, how will you write about it? How will you know it? Is it wise to withdraw, or should you be going forward and experiencing it a little more? I don't know, I'm asking. I'm not suggesting.
I feel like I've experienced enough of it to realize that this is something both very seductive and very distracting and dangerous in the end. And that, in the UK, for instance, there's been an interesting, I mean, maybe that supports my argument that the people are prepared to turn away a little from investing their hopes and faith in technology and actually investing more faith in people who do the hard work, the so-called frontline nurses and carers who expose themselves to all kinds of risks when they do their work and are grossly underpaid for their efforts, and are still out there. I mean, these are the people who saved the United Kingdom from a much worse pandemic, and many of them literally sacrificed their lives. Technology failed us. The British government still can't come up with a reliable technological solution to this, and I very much doubt that the Indian government will be able to do anything like that. What has helped deal with the pandemic or mitigate its worst effects is, real flesh and blood human beings working extremely hard, exposing themselves to unprecedented risks, and coming through and pulling the rest of us through this crisis. There is supposedly second wave coming. People are better prepared, but I think the preparation is all at the level of human beings. Nobody is really investing much hope in any kind of technological solution at the time. It'll be great if the vaccine emerges. But again, that would be the work of people working in laboratories right now. So I think what this pandemic has shown to a large extent is that it's really extremely unwise to invest so much faith in these little apps that Steve Jobs came up with once upon a time, and thinking that this is going to save the world, and now all we need to do is to get online, get connected. Well, there's a lot more to be done before we can reach this technological utopia. I think some basic things were forgotten, and I think people are now realizing that actually the people who are on the front line ought to be better paid, they ought to be better respected by society, as opposed to these, people who are starting up all kinds of online ventures, the dot-com ventures, managed to get a lot of money from VC, and go bust in about 2 years or 3 years after making millions of dollars. I think the sort of grotesquely the sort of scale of priorities in our societies, I think many of us are being forced to question them. Like, why are we giving all our rewards to these unproductive people and neglecting the people who are actually saving us from early death and serious illness?
In the conversation, you said something about how our concern is more about what is happening in the backyard and the shrinkage of international coverage. I wonder, is this like a foretelling of what is to come, that we will all become like, our worlds will now become much more intense and more concentrated, more local, and we'll drop this global local kind of thing that happened? What do you suspect?
Well, there's certainly some kind of regionalization happening, or localization happening. I mean, some of it is the result of the fact that a whole lot of lines and channels of communication have been broken. So you can't easily fly from one country to another right now, certainly not from one continent to another. People can talk to each other on the phone or on video, as we are doing, but whole sort of series of exchanges and back and forth that used to happen is not happening right now. Conferences, seminars, all kinds of meetings. There's a whole sort of global industry of that, which has come to a complete halt. And all of us are being forced at this point to devote our energies to combating, or worrying at least, about this pandemic, which might and has killed many, many people. So I feel that going forward, some of these habits will linger, even after the flights resume, that I think we'll become more alert to just how fragile our particular worlds are. And I think the first impulse would be to strengthen those fragile life worlds. Some of that might be misdirected by demagogues, who will use that to strengthen their power. And I think, in other places that might actually, contribute to a better society. I mean, it's interesting. I was reading about Singapore, about the migrant workers there who used to be very, very badly treated in Singapore. And then during the pandemic, they became, the workers' dormitories, they became the big source of the virus at one point. And that, for many Singaporeans, was a shocking reminder of just how badly these people had been treated, just how inhuman their living conditions were. So the Singaporean government, and a lot of public opinion too, has been working now to improve their living conditions, because they know that with this virus, you're all in the same space. You need those migrant workers. You can't throw them out. So if you want them there and if you want them healthy, then you have to actually do something about that. And so focusing on that right now, as opposed to thinking about when is trade going to restart in the way it was going on before the pandemic, when are the flights going to resume? Singapore Airlines is all right now completely grounded. So it's a very small example of just how we may all be forced to think again about our immediate worlds,
Yeah, like for instance, the NRI child and his parents in India, how that negotiation seemed to happen effortlessly, and you could always fly down if there was a necessity, and now suddenly that's not possible.
That's
So
not
even I think the nature of this uh, small strip of Indian family, which had some international connections and whatnot, is going to have
possible.
to be
Yeah.
radically rewritten. And great fun for the social historian, no, Pankaj? Lots and lots to write about and think about. Yeah, in these times. So, you've defined the problem with with English identity with remarkable incisiveness in one of the essays. Can you complete this sentence for us? The problem with Indian identity is.
Ah, I think the problem with Indian identity is that it's necessarily fluid. Given our long cultures, our histories, our diversity, there can never be a singular Indian identity. But the problems arise when a fluid identity is forced to become a fixed one, or is sort of located in a particular experience, which is that of an upper caste Hindu. If the upper caste Hindu is going to dictate, or North Indian Hindu in this case, is going to dictate what Indian identity is or should be, then we've got a massive problem. Because India really, I mean, it's almost a cliche to say that. It's synonymous with diversity, it's with fluidity of ideas, of concepts, philosophical traditions, cultural traditions. And it's not that different from England. I mean, England invested so much in its empire existentially, not just in other ways, but the empire was a source of English identity for such a long time. I think the problem with this country really is that it hasn't managed to create a post-imperial identity for itself. Hence Brexit, hence all these fantasies of global Britain, of Britain being a global player, when it clearly isn't, it really is not. India, I think we are kind of trapped in a fantasy of Indian greatness, which we think can only be achieved once we are all comprehensively and assertively Indian. I know all kinds of Indians have very different takes on this particular notion. India can be a great country without without its identity being fixed in these very narrow provincial ways. So I really feel in many ways our problems arise from the fact that we are trying to make this miraculously, wonderfully fluid identity into something it cannot be, which is static and fixed.
What is the impulse to fix it? Where does that impulse come from?
Well, I think it's actually very, in a way, historically, and this is not a problem peculiar to India, but to many societies which were subjugated by imperialist powers in the 19th century, and they sought to learn lessons from the people who had subjugated them. And one lesson that they learned, quite wrongly, I think, was that these people are powerful because they're all so united and their identity is so clear. They're all Christians. They all have the same language. They all, and they have such a coherent identity, such a cohesive sense of themselves. And that is what we should also do in order to survive in this world that these people have created, essentially. So that was the lesson many anti-colonial activists, many people at the time, we were talking earlier before we started this conversation formally about the Marathi Brahmins or the Bengali Brahmins. There were others, in Java, in Egypt, various parts of the world who arrived at similar conclusions that their own sort of very unorthodox past, their societies, their political traditions, their diversities, all of that had to be discarded and new singular identities erected if we are going to become a nation capable of holding its own and defending itself against foreigners, against foreign imperialist powers. So the origins of this quest for a singular identity are actually, in a way, honorable in the sense that it was a defensive maneuver against imperialist powers. But I think a lot was obscured and falsified in the process. And what was falsified primarily was this long history and tradition of ours, which was always very, very, very diverse, and it did not lend itself to, one singular identity.
Okay. What are you working on now?
Oh, there's always something or other. I mean, I'm way behind my new book, although you would say that's we don't need another book for at least another 4 or 5 years from you. So I think I might just give myself a couple more years before I get to the finish line on it.
But this one, can you give us a hint of what it's about? Is it a collection of essays or is it a...
Oh, no, this is, in fact, I mean, I would happily talk about it. It's still in a way, it's still not come together in my head. And I know if I say something about it, it'll probably disappear, leaving a big hole in my head.
Okay.
It should be difficult to fill
Yeah,
out.
but anyway, it'd be nice to know because, I mean, you've dealt with Buddhism, you've dealt with butter chicken. It'll be interesting to keep the suspense going. I think
Maybe I should write about Bollywood now. The book you did not write. Oh, actually, you did write a wonderful book on Helen.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. Okay.
what are you working on now, if I may ask?
Sorry?
What are you working on, if I may ask?
I'm trying to get that the next novel together. Like it's a Bildungsroman, a growing up novel in Bombay in the 1980s. What it was like to grow up with I don't know, Rajiv Gandhi and that moment. I'm working on it.
That sounds great, actually. Yeah. I would love to read that. So whenever you're done.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, Mr. Dharkar, I think you can take over from now. Thank you very much, Pankaj, for...
Thanks, Jerry, so much for doing this. That was fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, okay.
Well, thank you, Pankaj Mishra and Jerry Pinto, for this wide-ranging discussion on so many different subjects. I think you raised a lot of questions, which we could have had a Q&A session and asked you questions, but we'll wait for another day. I particularly like what you said about technological utopia not happening and how there's a disparity in the reward system for the people who actually work as opposed to people who create this technology on which we are here today, by the way. But that is a plus point. I mean, Pankaj, you're sitting in London, Jerry and I are in Bombay. But of course, I think the pandemic has shown the negative things of technology and how we reward people. The pandemic has done a lot of other things too. I was surprised when you talked about the shrinkage of foreign news and so on. You would have thought the pandemic would have brought in a global village. But what you're saying, in fact, is that the world is now getting more selfish and more self-centered. And nationalism has come to the fore. And I think we're going to see more of that when the vaccine is actually created and everyone's going to fight to get it. And ultra-nationalism is going to really come to the forefront. Finally, there's this question of Indian identity, which are we going to solve in this lifetime? I doubt it. Perhaps Mr. Modi will. But on that note, I will end. And thank you all. Thank you, Pankaj. Thank you, Jerry. And thank you, all of you who logged in today. Bye-bye.
Thanks.